Hello, and welcome to this month's edition of the Anomaly Archives Patreon-supported Anomaly Academy cadet level Patreon monthly presentations by various paranormal, anomaly, Fortean seekers. We really appreciate you joining us. If you are interested in finding out more about us, you can, of course, go to our website, anomalyarchives.org, or as you already know, you can go to patreon.com/anomaly archives, where, of course, we have various levels of membership, including this level at the Anomaly Academy cadet level, which gets you access to these live monthly lectures through which you can participate and ask questions of the presenter at the end of the presentation, and of course then gain access to all the back catalog, growing as it is, of materials from our past presenters. And of course, today we have a wonderful presentation from Professor WHAM, and I became aware of Professor WHAM almost 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, when our mutual friend Stephanie Quick brought her to my attention because of her dissertation. Very fascinating piece of research called Taken: Constructions of Race, Biology, and Colonialism Informing the Alien Abduction Narrative in the United States. A fascinating paper. And of course, she has a great book that we'll tell you a bit about in just a second. But Dr. Matthews, Professor WHAM, has studied paranormal experiences and reports for over 4 decades, has advanced degrees in religious studies and American cultural studies, and is an ardent environmentalist. She lives in the beautifully haunted Mid-Hudson Valley of New York State, where she teaches at local colleges and works for a prominent nonprofit organization. She has been a journalist and has also published poetry, short stories, academic papers, and a textbook on new religious movements. Of course, you can go to her website, professorwham.com. That's Professor WHAM.com. And you can find links there to her books, including this fantastic work, Mysterious Beauty. That's it right here. Living with the Paranormal in the Hudson Valley. And you can find links to her past interviews and many other interesting things, including her blog and vlog. So without further ado, I would like to bring on Professor WHAM.
Hi.
Hey, how you doing today?
Well, like I've said, it's hot here, so it's hot a lot of places. So this is a sweaty presentation. So all right.
Well, thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to this talk. Congratulations, you're a paranormal investigator with inspiration from a wealth of interesting, some known, some lesser known paranormal and UFO researchers, investigators, and experiencers that I know you have a fascination with, as do I. And we want to educate the public about these amazing people, some still with us and some who've passed on. And so I'll let you go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much. When Smiles asked me to do this, honestly, it took me a while to figure out exactly how to do this, because anybody who knows me well knows that I'm not a person who really grandstands. I don't make a lot of broad, definitive statements. I don't have a lot of theoretical hills that I'm going to stand on that I plan to die over. But I realized that I've been doing this for a long time. Kind of in the trenches, and that may give me some unique insights into kind of the best way to approach these kinds of things, paranormal investigations, whatever the paranormal is, as well as, especially in the current field that exists now, where you actually have individuals who are, trying to make their living doing this, on in television and big broadcast studios, that sort of thing. So what kind of advice might I give any newbie who has set themselves upon the quest to investigate what Jacques Vallée called forbidden science, or what Charles Fort more ironically referred to as the procession of the damned? And here we have, you'll recognize some of these people. Obviously, that's Jacques there on the, I should call him Dr. Vallée, I suppose, but since I have a PhD, I don't care. That he's the one on the furthest left from you. And then, of course, there's John Keel right next to him. And two individuals which you may or may not know a lot about is Paul Eno. He's the guy on the bottom. And he has recently passed, which was a great tragedy, and rather unexpected in some ways. And then to the far right, I guess my right, is Eugenia Macer-Story, whose work really needs to be known more widely because of her unique approach. She's actually someone that Jacques Vallée would come and visit whenever he would come to Manhattan, and just needed to hang out for a little bit because she worked in Manhattan. And he mentions her in one of his volumes of Forbidden Science. So he regarded her insights as being particularly important. But I did want to give a little bit more background about myself, so that I know a lot of you probably don't know exactly who I am. So as Smiles mentioned, I did the work necessary to achieve my PhD in American Critical Studies. But after I did that, I basically fled from the paranormal field for almost a decade. Not quite a decade, but almost a decade. There were two main reasons for that, but one main reason was, for those of you who have labored in graduate school, writing a dissertation often does that to a person. You just want to leave and never come back. And as a result of that, I developed this weird reflexive reaction, so that whenever a friend of mine or a colleague or, just somebody even that I was meeting would come up and say to me, "Oh, I'm going to start graduate school. I'm going to go and do something," and they would be all excited about what they would be studying. My reflexive reaction was to always go, "Oh, I'm sorry," which is not a very polite thing. And I tried to make it into a joke, but, for people who are still set on post-secondary education, it's not very nice. So, in much the same way, oftentimes, if someone comes up to me, and this has happened a couple of times, and they say to me, "Oh, I'm going to start researching Bigfoot," or "I'm going to be a, paranormal investigator. I'm really interested in this." My response, internal reaction, is to tell them to run away as fast as they can. Do anything else now, quickly. Save yourself from the torment, the frustration, and the endless political BS that you will surely encounter. And certainly don't try to make a living at it. I mean, that's like my first response always. But lately, I've decided to just stick with counsel that came from Eugenia Macer-Story. When she wrote her first book on UFOs way back in, I think it was the early mid 70s, maybe it was 77. Anyway, it was in the 70s when she wrote her first book on UFOs. And it was actually one of the first books that was more about the effect of UFO sightings on people rather than the UFOs themselves, like you can study UFOs themselves. But she entitled it, "Congratulations, the UFO reality," kind of like, yeah, this has happened to you. Good for you, So congratulations, you're a paranormal investigator. So what follows are a few suggestions and observations from me, a researcher who has been slogging away at these topics for over 4 decades. But I offer these things only as a consult might, with the intention to keep your mind sane, your interest robust, and of course, invoking David Lynch, your blue rose petals fresh. And those of you who know that reference will know exactly what I mean. Exactly. And your emotional state relatively stable. But like I said, first, a little bit about me. So I grew up in a household where what might broadly be called paranormal topics or experiences, such as ghosts, spirits, discarnate entities, were taken for granted. My father had had a number of these experiences in his life, including living in a haunted house as a child, including one very close and terrifying ghost encounter that he would occasionally tell us about. He had a UFO sighting as a child when he was on a newspaper route. He had a number of very strange experiences while he was in the military, and he had a missing time episode as an adult, a fairly significant one, which I remember because I was in middle school. Now, he was very religious, and he believed devoutly in ghosts and demons. Interestingly, he didn't mention angels so much. It was more the negative side of everything. But he did believe in realms of the spirit. So he was rigidly religious and interpreted these kinds of things in very specific ways. But the point is he didn't ridicule the reality of the actual events themselves. So the notion of discarnate entities or other worlds, even other dimensions, didn't bother him. Although he could be incredibly dense when it came to understanding and accepting other kinds of scientific data. For example, just so you know, I grew up in a household where both my parents, and my mom still is because my father passed recently, they are young earthers. So they only believe that the earth is about 6,000 or 7,000 years old. So I was brought up in that kind of weird milieu. Now, more to the point, my father didn't believe in any thought system that impugned what he accepted as Christianity, or that fostered a worldview that from his perspective was devoid of meaning. He actually told me once that God had allowed Satan to create fossils and place them in the ground in order to deceive us. So he was basically admitting that his version of Christianity was a kind of conspiracy theory. Now, for those of you who've checked out my interviews, you know that I also lived in an abusive household. It wasn't just very religious, it was abusive. And my father was the abuser, and I was usually the target of his abuse. And, I'm not going to go into all of that now. You can listen to some of my vlogs and hear some of the details about that. I'm not sure how that played into my paranormal experiences, because I know that there is a school of thought that maintains that early trauma can make a person more susceptible to certain kinds of experiences. I don't know about that. I know that my own early UFO experience, even though it was terrifying to me in a lot of ways, it was also, the changes it created in me were also very positive for the most part. So somehow, my parents' indoctrination process failed with me. Christianity never took. That's been a sore spot in my family ever since. I'm kind of the black sheep of the family. I was always more scientific. I was always more curious. From a very early age, I was obsessed with science and current events. I was reading at an adult level by the age of 6. So I demanded that my mom help me get books from the adult section of the library. This is way before there was an internet. This isn't going to date me. It was in the 1960s. And I was especially interested in animals, plants, and ancient civilizations. I first wanted to be an archaeologist. That was my first love. My mom was glad I was reading, so she tended to get me whatever I wanted. Now, in retrospect, when I think about this now, I was profoundly attracted to things that initially scared me. So if it scared me, I was attracted to it, be they tornadoes, spiders, snakes, later ghosts, UFOs, other mysteries. Now, first, I wanted to know if I really needed to be afraid of such things. And I found out, for example, that spiders are very cool and do not merit the scaredy duties that we put on them. So spiders now live rent-free in my house. And if they need to go outside because they're outside spiders, I take them out. But if the items of my inquiry were still scary after investigation, then I wanted to know the mystery. I wanted to know what it was really about. And it's been my observation that many paranormal investigators are similarly, if not identically, inclined. In high school, I took every chemistry, physics, and biology class that was offered, including a lot of college prep courses. This is way before they had AP or anything like that. I actually did go to a very good high school that was well funded. And so we had a lot more offerings than a lot of other places, especially in Kansas. A lot of people think of Kansas as being very, reprobate. It became that later. It wasn't when I was going through high school. We actually not only had German and French and Spanish, but we also had Chinese and Russian. So I actually studied German and Chinese in high school. And I made it all the way up to pre-calculus because I fully intended to go into research chemistry in college. So I have this intense scientific background, in physics and in chemistry. In fact, chemistry was really sort of the thing I liked the best. However, as you can imagine from my upbringing, I had a number of personal problems. And so life kind of intervened, and it took me about a decade to get my own life back together. Now, during this time, I was still doing paranormal investigation, but I was doing it informally. I read a lot. I paid attention to what I could pay attention to. This was in the late 70s, early 80s. But I basically went into the business community, and I owned a couple businesses, did that sort of thing. Eventually, though, I returned back to school. And by the time I returned, my interests had moved in other directions. So I immersed myself in a number of different languages, as well as I was trained in documentary research, which is working in archives, and critical studies in religion, which that involved field research. So I have this varied background, not only in science, grounded in science, but then also working with historical materials, manuscript materials, and also learning how to interview people. So my scientific foundation and the years in graduate school helped me to develop skills that I still use today in my paranormal research. Not only can I get through a lot of the technical stuff that sometimes comes up when hard data does exist that needs to be analyzed, but I also have the ability to patiently comb through archives, manuscripts, finding those bits and clues that can illuminate and demonstrate patterns of sightings, narratives, and historical context. So one of the things I would say to people is that being at least somewhat conversant in a number of different disciplines helps you a great deal when it comes to this topic. And all of these individuals were conversant in different disciplines. They were coming at it from different ways, different places, but they were all conversant in different disciplines. For example, Jacques Vallée obviously can speak many languages. A lot of people don't know this about Eugenia, but she taught herself Spanish and some Russian and some French and some Italian so that she could actually access paranormal materials in those languages and correspond with people in other nations so that she could connect with them. And in fact, one of the rarest of her papers that I was able to locate was actually, I don't know if it's still available there, but was actually published in a Russian journal of electromagnetism. So even she had a fairly wide reach. I know Paul, because he was studying to be a priest initially, he had a background in classical studies and in Latin and in Greek. I don't know all the languages that John Keel might have known, but he traveled widely, especially when he was young, and became fairly conversant in some other languages, at least for the time period that he was there. He spent time in India in his early life, time in Afghanistan, time in Nepal. And he figured out ways of communicating with people. So it's very important to sort of be flexible and be willing to learn new skills. Now, in addition to this, in my life, as I indicated, I also had some odd experiences myself. So I'm not just a scholar. And I think I got this tendency from my father. God bless him. As indicated earlier, I had had a close UFO sighting with an older neighborhood friend when I was 5 or 6. I don't really recall now exactly what age I was, but I do remember that it changed me. I didn't have a frame of reference for the experience at the time. So I wasn't thinking in my mind, oh, I'm seeing a UFO. This was in the late 60s. I guess it would have been 66, 67, something like that. And UFOs were not talked about in mass media at all, in mainstream media. It was very, very rare, much, much more rare than it is now. And it was an extraordinary experience that when I look back on it, I can really see my life before and my life after. It changed me. And at the same time, I sometimes had strange precognitive dreams, knew that things were going to happen before they did. And that's still something that happens with me every now and then. I don't know where that comes from. Although I didn't accept the religious perspective of my family, I have tended to be, and this, I may get this from my dad too, I have tended to be what is broadly called spiritual or metaphysical. I put this in brackets because I don't really know what those words mean exactly. Oriented, or at least interested in religious or spiritual topics and modalities, because like many investigators, I have found there is a paranormal grist for the mill to be found in religious literature, records of religious or mystical experience, and then that broad, mysterious topic area that is often pointed to obliquely as the occult. So for me, none of this contradicted my scientific interests. The two approaches were just different ways of understanding the world, particularly the strange aspects of it. So the consequence of this was a multi-decade experiential research investigation, which actually happened partly in graduate school and partly outside of graduate school. It's kind of a whole story in and of itself. Into all of the major religions, many of the smaller alternative ones, such as the Shakers and various UFO cults, as well as a rather exhaustive foray into channeled materials, some of which I like the Seth material, and some of which I don't, like the I Am material, and various alternative third testaments, like the Urantia book, A Course in Miracles, the Book of Mormon, OSPI. You know, the United States has produced like a metric ton of these kinds of texts. So all of this strange alternative material has shaped how I approach paranormal research. Namely, I can do it from a number of angles. And to me, it's actually notable that a lot of these extra testamental texts, or third testaments, as they're sometimes referred to, like Book of Mormon or OSPI, a lot of these texts actually either mention extraterrestrials or they allude to things that could be interpreted that way. It's kind of interesting. So people who are having odd revelations and writing these texts are interested in this stuff too. It's just kind of strange. Now, as I was writing this presentation, I thought about how many investigators, at least the ones that I will be referencing today, they were all initiated into the realm of what we call high strangeness through some kind of direct experience. And they all talk about it in their writings. For example, Jacques Vallée, in one of his early books, and he actually mentions this several times in subsequent books, when he was, he had just gotten his degrees and he was doing some training with one of his mentors at a French military installation. They all witnessed strange objects that were being picked up on French military radar that should not have been there in the upper atmosphere. In other words, these objects, or whatever, these blips, that they were picking up, were actually violating the laws of physics, and were clearly coming back as solid objects. He talks about that, and he talks about how it freaked everybody else out there. And eventually, some calls were made, of course, up the chain of command, and they received this curious command to just purge all the records, without explanation, just purge them. And he talks about how this startled him and it troubled him. And it was the beginning of his willingness to look into reports that, official records don't want to acknowledge exist. John Keel, in his Jadoo book, which was recently republished a few years ago, he talks about a bizarre encounter with an unknown creature that he had while trekking through Nepal. Now, he had had a number of interesting encounters. What he was doing is basically exploring the world, during the 1950s, when it was still possible for, a white person from the West to go through parts of the Near East and Middle East without really being accosted too much. And he was going through, India, and he was working to disprove fakirs and hucksters who were pulling the wool over people's eyes in order to make a living in India and the Middle East. Although he did witness a few things that he couldn't quite explain. But when he got to Nepal, and of course was trekking around up there, he heard, stories about, I guess, about the Yeti. He wanted to see if he could find the Yeti. He'd heard these tales. And so he went in search of one, and he found something. And whatever it was scared the crap out of him. You know, it flung rocks at him. He never got close to it. He could see it from a distance, but it was enough to convince him that there was something to it. It sort of changed his perspective on, you know, some of these stories. Eugenia Macer-Story tells of her sighting, which changed the trajectory of her life. She was standing on a train platform outside of Boston, trying to decide whether she should go back to Boston, where she did have some work, or go back to New York City and pursue her interest as a playwright in avant-garde theater. And while she was standing there, she saw a UFO. And this UFO, the sighting of it created in her, as she puts it, a strange sensation, and ideas and thoughts seemed to intrude into her mind. And she found she could suddenly read and understand very technical journals and papers subsequent to this experience, obviously, detailing work being done on electromagnetism, gravity, and superstring mechanics. She had never even been interested in this stuff before. She found that she could actually do calculus and understand it, which she had never had any interest in it, had never, you know, had always avoided math, higher mathematics in particular, if she could. So something about this event changed her. And Paul Eno, as I mentioned earlier, he had been training for the priesthood, but he was very interested in paranormal activity because of some experiences that he'd had. And so he began to follow, and he worked for a little while, Ed and Lorraine Warren around. And it was during one investigation at a particularly intensely haunted place, where they were trying to figure out what kind of exorcism they were going to do, that he had a very physical experience with an entity that up to this point he had thought was completely discarnate. You know, he believed that there were different types of beings, you know, maybe demons or other types of beings, haunting beings, who created poltergeist activity so that they could create physical effects. But he didn't believe that they were physical in any way themselves. And he actually had an experience where an entity rushed at him, or he could see something rushing at him, and he reflexively put his arm out, you know, like you might, you know, to kind of grab it, and he actually felt it. He actually felt his hand close around something that was physical, and then it went away. And that completely changed his trajectory in his understanding of what he might be dealing with. So these narratives of transformation, when experience forces a different view of reality, are really the bread and butter of my own focus. That's actually what my master's thesis is about. It's about when people have these experiences and it completely changes them, and then they look back at their lives and they reconstruct their lives through the lens of this experience. In philosophical terms, such instances are what might be called crises of epistemology. Now, for those of you who don't know, epistemology is the study of that which can be known, or even more broadly, it concerns questions about knowledge or knowing. What are our criteria of knowledge? How do we know what we think we know? And connected to this, of course, is what counts as data, as well as methods of collection and analysis. Now, interestingly enough, our standards of epistemology, and I'm talking about our common everyday standards, not like a physicist's standard of epistemology, because obviously they're coming at it from a completely different perspective. But the common everyday language that we use, epistemological language that we use, is still based on classical Greek categories. This is why Bruno Latour, who is a prescient critic of Western science and humanism, could write a book called We Have Never Been Modern, in which he is able to show that what we have referred to as the modern world, beginning with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, was more or less an adoption a very clumsy adoption, an adaptation, kind of a marrying of the atomism of the Greek thinker Democritus, latched very clumsily onto certain ideas that are Neoplatonic and Aristotelian and a few other things, and that we've been laboring in these narrow options ever since. It's limited our ability to see options, to understand that the universe is larger and more varied than we can even imagine. And another example of this can be what happens oftentimes to some Bigfoot researchers, such as my friend Gail, who believe that, or she used to believe, that Bigfoot was just an unknown primate of some type. Now, she still thinks that there's a sense in which they're that, but she understands, or she believes she understands, that there's something much more complicated than that. And the story that she tells is the story of an investigation that she did with a group of, nuts and bolts Bigfoot researchers at a fairly well-known, it's well-known locally here in the Hudson Valley, habituation site, some private property up near Columbia County, where a lot of people have had strange experiences, including animal disturbances, animal mutilations, all kinds of weird footprints, that kind of thing. Even instances of horses having their tails braided, just really odd things. And this happened back in 2013, in December of 2013. And she had brought some nuts and bolts, quote unquote, Bigfoot researchers over from Massachusetts. They actually had a FLIR camera, and they were going to go down into this area where the owner of the property had been sort of trying to interact with whatever it was. He would leave food out for them or for whomever, and he would find in the next morning that sometimes there would be disturbances with the food. The food was eaten in very odd ways. There's all kinds of details about that. Anyway, they went down there one evening, and this was in December. They went down one evening when they heard noises coming from this one area of the woods that was right up next to a creek. That's where the border of the property was. And they, the investigator from Massachusetts, he got out his FLIR camera and he started training it, trying to figure out what was going on. And they actually caught footage of 5 distinct somethings that were about 100 yards from them in the darkness, that were moving and making an incredible amount of noise, and hooting and throwing rocks at them, and were much larger than a human being could be. And fortunately, he pushed record, so the footage still exists. I've actually seen it. But what was really interesting was that as soon as he got the footage started, and he yelled contact, cacophony broke out. Whatever was on the other side of the creek started tearing up trees, breaking them like big trees, large trees, started uprooting them. I guess it was just, the noise was just cacophonous. And about 2 minutes later, as everybody was fumbling around trying to get, various images and everything, and trying to pass the FLIR around and see, the guys started getting sick. Gail didn't get sick, but the guys started getting sick. They started getting faint and nauseated, and one of them actually started throwing up, and he eventually had to retreat back to the house. And as soon as it kind of reached a peak, according to Gail, and she still freaks out when she tells me this, all of a sudden there was this blue light that just infused the entire woods. And the blue light coalesced into a single point. It shot up into the sky, and everything fell silent. And as she put it to me, she said, well, we have lots of data, but I have no idea what the hell just happened. We have no explanation for it whatsoever. So that was her turning point. She had this experience where these very physical things were happening. They actually got physical data. And then something happened that no one can explain. In my book, Mysterious Beauty, I actually have a photo that she let me use of the damage to the trees that was done when they went back and took a picture of it the next morning when it was light. And there was no storm there. I don't know what could do that kind of damage. It was really amazing. So you may think that Bigfoot is simply an unknown species of giant primate, but then something else happens. Now, the same is true for UFO sightings. A lot of investigators don't want to refer to UFOs as paranormal in nature. They've got to be real spacecraft or something craft, And then there's all those strange patterns where UFOs and Bigfoot are seen together, and suddenly a house over which UFOs were seen begins to exhibit poltergeist behavior. So it's not so simple, is it? It's not that clear cut. So in my case, my UFO experience served to validate my existence as a curious person, and that my tendency to not jump to my father's religious conclusions was perfectly correct. Now, it did put me at odds with my family, a situation that has never been remedied. On the other hand, I was left to my own devices in terms of research and interest, and I have followed my own path ever since. So I've gone through many of the stages that investigators go through: obsession, determination to discover the secret, camping out in fields, houses, watching strange shows, reading stranger books, getting scared, believing in all the conspiracies. And don't worry, there are some conspiracies. They're just not like QAnon kinds of conspiracies. And then I became a skeptic for a little while. During graduate school, there was a point when I became a skeptic. Probably because I'd become detached enough to write both a master's thesis and a doctoral dissertation on various aspects of the UFO narrative, but also because I just couldn't deal with the larger UFO paranormal community that sometimes seems to go on binges of eating its own young every few years. I've basically encountered almost every theory about UFOs and the paranormal out there, and I do have a few pet inquiries, but no answers as such. So what I'm going to do now is just sort of talk a little bit about my advice. If you're going to be a paranormal investigator, congratulations. This is what I would tell you, given my experience. So the first thing is to cultivate wonder and humility, which I don't know that we always do that enough. Be curious about other people, other ideas, other cultures, ancient stories. This means being open. Don't think you know very much. If you think you have a theory, presume that you're probably wrong about some major portion of it. Assume that the universe is more wonderful than it is terrifying. And that is something that actually I got from both John Keel, even though he sort of lapsed into more terrifying later in his life. But certainly Paul Eno, that was always something that he suggested. Even though there are scary things out there, and he ended up talking a lot about parasites, which I'll talk about a little bit more about in a minute. He always maintained that the best way to approach paranormal investigations is to assume that because you are here and able to experience and see them, that's something special. And it's part of the wonder of the universe. So assume that the universe is more wonderful than it is terrifying. I know this is contra Lovecraft, but Lovecraft was an unhappy person. Information and interesting ideas can come from the most unlikely of places. The first patterns that you see are likely those that are already part of what you're assuming or your environment. There are many forms of pareidolia, and not all of them are just in your eyes. So this is probably the characteristic that will most help you when it comes to the more stubborn aspects of thankless research, because paranormal investigation is often thankless. Most of us are not going to get famous doing this, and most certainly will not probably be able to make a living at it. Such research will not necessarily make you more popular or accepted. And take it from me, even a well-regarded dissertation of the topic. I actually passed my oral defense of my dissertation with distinction. That's actually on my transcript. And that doesn't happen very often, but it did not get me a job, an academic job. Concurrently, ghosts do not just show up because you have a spirit box and are ready for a conversation, despite what television seems to indicate. Colleagues who I know who continue to venture out to Pine Bush in New York, or into what I call the sticky ticky woods of Columbia County here in the Hudson Valley, where the Kinderhook creature once roamed, are more likely to witness pleasant, quiet nights and get mosquito bites than they are to get a whole lot of paranormal data. The phenomena doesn't tend to present itself by expectation, yet obviously if you're not around to see it, you surely won't. So enjoy what is in front of you and be ready. Although truth be told, when and if the event occurs, it probably will not be what you expect, so you'll forget to pull out the camera anyway, and if you do and take a picture, it will be blurry. We already know this, okay? Probably the most valuable thing that my field research has taught me is how to be very quiet and still for extended periods of time. There are lots of things to observe in these environments, just, even while you're just looking for the quote unquote special stuff. It's sort of like meditation. So enjoy the peaceful times for what they are. And please don't do what they do on those stupid ghost shows. Do not yell at the ghosts. I do not understand this yelling at the ghosts business. Another thing is to listen to experiencers and other researchers. So this is connected to the above. The importance of listening and not just opening your mouth. It's not that experiencers are always right. It's that their accounts are often where the search for data begins. When I started doing my field research, I made a careful study of the interview techniques used by police detectives and forensic investigators, not because my subjects are criminals, obviously, but those techniques, when used gently and not as interrogations, are intended to get to the heart of a story, to encourage disclosure, often of difficult or unofficial materials. Once you get a person started on their account, you just listen and you only ask for clarification. You become a study in neutrality to the best of your ability, unless something that comes up that requires a little challenge or clarification. For example, what I like to think of is way back when I was first collecting my accounts in the late 80s and early 90s, that would lead to my master's. I had several conversations with a woman who presented to me the first praying mantis entity contact that I had ever heard of. I mean, now they're fairly common. But at the time in the literature, there weren't very many of those. And in fact, I think if I remember right, her relaying of that experience to me was the first time I'd ever heard of such a thing. Well, of course, with my background, in my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, you wake up and there's a giant praying mantis over you. I know what praying mantises do, right? And I interrupted her in the middle of her talking and I said, oh my God, I would be terrified. I mean, if I woke up and a giant praying mantis was over me, and she said, yeah, you'd think that would terrify you. She said, but for some reason it didn't. There was this the kind of essence of love and acceptance coming from it. And it didn't harm me. It was very gentle with me. And in my mind, I'm going, okay, it was like the weirdest thing, but her reaction like that was not something that she probably would have said in quite that way if I hadn't told her what my response was. So it's perfectly okay to respond as a human being. That is part of what this technique is. It's also important to listen to other researchers because oftentimes they notice things that you don't, since they are coming at topics or cases from a different perspective. One of the things that has always irritated me, still irritates me, about certain sectors of the paranormal community is the way in which many researchers will try to compete with each other rather than collaborate on a given case or a set of phenomena. I mean, who are we really trying to impress? Seriously. I mean, regular mainstream scientists are always going to ignore us. And I'm not going to argue with people about stuff that's already contested, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. And this is another thing that I always have really appreciated about the four individuals, or especially Eugenia and Paul and Jacques. I mean, John Keel kind of went off on his own because of who he was. But Jacques and Paul and Eugenia, they were very much collaborators. They did their own research, but they connected with other people all the time, corresponded with them, got their ideas. Paul, in particular, loved to go on sort of like group expeditions to places, and so that you would have different people that specialized in different things, going to certain sites where paranormal stuff would happen, so that they could bring back their own impressions and data and then collate it all. I mean, to me, that's a real important approach. It's an approach that I've tried to develop over the course of my life. As you're developing your research, use the skill sets that you have. Bring whoever you are to it, and also be exactly who you are. And as I mentioned earlier, don't be afraid to learn new skills. If you are a writer, read and write. If you are an astrophysicist like Vallée, apply your technical skills to the data. If you are principally a poet, artist, and playwright like Eugenia Macer-Story was, then see how those talents can explicate the experiences you're researching and collecting. All of these individuals, all four of them, made their living doing other things. Okay? I mean, like, for example, we think of John Keel as being a writer in Fortiana, but he actually made his living as a freelance journalist, basically covering baseball and other sports for local, regional, and even national news outlets. So he wrote about all kinds of things. That's how he made his living. He just also did this paranormal stuff. Eugenia made her living as a playwright, a theater director, and an occasional psychic. She actually still remains fairly well known, despite her passing, within the small but influential avant-garde theatrical community in New York City. People still will do some of her work, even though she's not there to direct it anymore. And that's what she did for a living. She also had a small stipend that she got from her family. She came from a military family. But it wasn't a lot. So she did other stuff to make a living, but then she did her paranormal research. And Paul Eno, he was basically a theologian. And like any theologian, he remained interested in God, and issues of the divine, the nature of the divine, but he was principally concerned with serving and healing others. So his research moved forward with that focus, and he was always working as an editor for a regular newspaper. So he had a regular job as well. And of course, we all know that Jacques Vallée has been a working scientist, a pioneer in computer technologies for his entire life. Now, I am a scholar, as I've indicated, but my paranormal studies are things that I do on the side. They are an avocation. I have been a teacher. I have been a college professor. I have been a writer. But most importantly for me, I am a mystic. And I'm interested in the connections between states of consciousness and experiential reality. In addition to teaching and working in education, which I have done for 35 years, I am an active member of and teacher in an established mystical order whose identifiable roots go back over 1,400 years. Because I have practiced controlling myself during changes in consciousness, I'm very attuned to the importance of when changes in those states take place within an experiential arena. So it's hard for me to get caught off guard. So in essence, keep your day job, but let those skills inform how you go about your research. Now, connected to knowing yourself is also knowing what your intentions are in studying paranormal materials. Why are you investigating this? Are you into this because of an experience you've had, family or friends have had? Are you just a weirdo who has always been into strange things? Because that's true of some of us. Are you one of those people who want to make a living at this? This is actually one of the most important questions you can ask yourself, because it really will influence how you conduct research and investigations. Now, a few years ago, I read a poll that claimed internet searches for and about UFOs and other paranormal topics were only eclipsed by inquiries about pornography. Now, I don't know if that was true then or if it's true now, but no one can doubt that shows covering UFOs and other paranormal topics are a big business. My own inclination is to caution people away from trying to make a living on the experiences of other people, because that's actually what you're really doing. While it is possible, if one has the skill and contacts to create a business around a paranormal topic, for example, one successful venture has been Small Town Monsters by Seth Breedlove and his group. And there's another investigator, Allison Jornlin, who has put together with her brother a company that's called Milwaukee Ghost Walks. And there are a few individuals who've created relatively successful podcasts on Patreon or YouTube or other platforms. The fact is, most of us are not going to become influencers or broadcast beacons. And of course, right now there's a glut in the market. So you really have to stand out in interesting ways, which does cause some people to sacrifice quality over quantity. And even people who have had successful and ethical ventures and who post regularly are really making very little money on those ventures themselves relative to the amount of time put into each episode. And almost all of them have at least one, if not numerous, side hustles. So understand this. Be prepared, if you're going to do that, to have a shtick and to work and work and work and work. I always tell people also to have some kind of regular life. Knowing who you are and what you're doing can be vital, because paranormal encounters, although sometimes exhilarating, are often experienced as very destabilizing. And it still happens to me. I go to a gym several times a week. The gym is haunted. It's haunted enough that the owner of the business has motion detector cameras up in every room because stuff is happening there almost all the time. I know this. I've had a few experiences there, but there are certain types of experiences that just because of who I am, I won't put up with. I don't mind poltergeist experiences. I can kind of deal with that. But when disembodied voices start coming out of speakers that have been turned off and disconnected from electricity, that's my hard limit. I'm not going to have conversations like that with whatever is there. Okay. But if you pay attention to the best investigators, you'll find that they were grounded enough that they were able to stand firm. Paul Eno, for example, could help clear haunts pretty quickly, and he had a really good record of that. John Keel and Eugenia Macer-Story faced down poltergeists and got them to stop and leave, and both of them have had stories about that. I know a couple of experienced researchers in Pine Bush who are not widely known except locally, who can seemingly both call and banish certain kinds of UFO activity. I haven't gone out with them yet to watch them do that, but it's well attested that they can do that. And certainly Harley Rutledge, who smiles will know, of Project Identification, knew that he had to turn towards his regular life in order to ensure the UFO phenomenon that was interacting with him and his family would not intrude too much. Having this life is important, and I often think about the choices made by Albert Bender, who some of you may know of, the UFO researcher who founded one of the first international civilian UFO organizations in the early 1950s, and just as suddenly backed out of it right as membership was reaching a peak. Years later, Bender, after having been badgered to do so by Gray Barker, wrote his account of what had happened. According to Bender, his obsession with UFOs had led to a strange visitation. 3 odd-looking men appeared in his room one night and basically told him to stop his investigations or else. They gave him a number of other directives, including a time frame of silence, after which he would be permitted to tell his story. They also said that if he desisted, he would live a happy life. And they gave him a taste of what he would experience if he didn't do as they said, which was a series of blinding, debilitating headaches. So he obeyed, at least according to his story. Now, of course, skeptics would say that since Bender had fallen in love just prior to his closing of shop, that he just wanted to spend time with his girlfriend, namely, he'd gotten an obsession. The problem with that is that he met his girlfriend from within the UFO community. She shared his fascination with UFOs and wanted to get to the bottom of it all, too. There was no conflict between his personal and investigatory life, so to speak. Furthermore, he could have just said he wanted to pursue his personal life more fully. He had partners in the organization that he could have passed the reins on to if he had wanted to. There was literally no need to come up with this bizarre story. And I really encourage you to read his story It was republished a few years ago because it really is one of the strangest stories I've ever read. It's as strange as some of the MIB reports collected by Bertold Schwartz several years later. The strange men told Bender that they didn't want anyone to find out about their activities on Earth and that they feared his work would expose them. Now, make of that what you will. But what I've come to believe about that part is that the lesson here for us might also be that obsession might not be the healthiest approach to the topic because of our own tendencies as human beings to confabulate and be glamored. Just like anybody who does really hard work, like healthy homicide detectives. Not all homicide detectives are healthy, but some of them are, or people who work as forensic scientists, people who really do difficult, kind of nasty work. They survive better if they have some kind of safe home life to return to, some kind of normalcy, be it in relationships, other mundane occupations, spiritual practice. Some of the younger investigators I've met have already figured this out, and kudos to them. Probably the most important thing, or second to the most important thing, we're getting to the end here. Let the phenomena teach you, because it will. Otherwise, you'll be ground down into a tiny nub of a person. In my experience and observation, the best investigators begin with the data that they have, whether it's experiences or measurements when those can be had, and they follow where it leads. Don't expect answers, just expect more wonder and more questions to emerge. Now, when thinking about this point, I kept being drawn to describe the moment when I realized my own native techniques paralleled in some ways the work of a German philosopher and mathematician, Edmund Husserl. Now, without using too much jargon, I have a degree in philosophy, so you can shoot me now. Without using too much jargon, Husserl sought to find a way of knowing beyond simply relying on historical context and psychology, both of which can induce and produce distortions when interpreting data. Basically, he was trying to deal with questions of epistemology. You know, how can we figure out what's going on with something when we encounter something that we don't understand or that we've never seen before? He called his work phenomenological reduction, or what would later come to be called phenomenology, that it's more of a posture towards data than just an interpretation of data. Basically, he said that when you're presented with something new, at least to you, you bracket the data in your mind, suspending it without evaluation at least as much as possible. This process of bracketing is called performing epoche. It's E-P-O-C-H. It looks like epoche, but it's epoche is how you pronounce it. It's a process by which biases and assumptions are blocked out in order to explain a phenomenon in terms of its own inherent system of meaning. Then you sit with the data in an active way so that it can begin to reveal itself in situ. Now, obviously, there are all kinds of ways in which you can critique this philosophically and practically. I mean, with modern physics now, we know that nothing exists in situ. Everything exists in relationship. Your simple observation of it and even bracketing it would change it. I mean, we know that now, right? So it's a practice. It's not something you can do perfectly. And obviously, if the data that you're bracketing is dangerous to you, you need to get the hell out. You know, it's like there are things you don't want to bracket. You just want to evaluate and get yourself out of the way. But it's a posture towards data. So it's a tendency to follow the data rather than your assumptions about it. And that has proven useful to me. It's basically an approach taken by many Fortean investigators and advanced by both Paul Eno and Jacques Vallée in different ways. In fact, I would go so far as to say that that's part of the reason why I'm really resistant in making overarching theories or pronouncements, because I don't think we have nearly enough information to do so. Sometimes this does mean returning to older data. You know, one of the things that happens is in this practice is that, and some investigators have started to do this, looking at older cases in order to re-examine with new ideas, accounts, and experiences that have been relegated to obscurity because they didn't fit social narratives at the time, or they weren't the fashion in the UFO paranormal community, or that they were just truly odd. There are researchers like Chris Aubeck, who is an associate of Jacques Vallée. They've written a couple books together, but Chris Aubeck has kind of gone on his own to write some other books about re-examining some of the stuff that, say, Charles Fort investigated. He's recently written a book in which he looks at all of the letters that Charles Fort wrote to newspaper editors, advertising his own news clipping service so that he could get accounts from people, and examining and analyzing them for the interesting information that they provide about his sources, what he was using, what he was dipping into. There's also been a series of books that have been started by William Van Utrecht and Martin Shaw called Redemption of the Damned, where they actually go through Charles Fort's most famous accounts, his most famous stories, and they re-examine them in light not only of what we now know about science and physics and what could be going on, but even what sources were saying at the time about some of his reports. So it's actually a very interesting book. There are some podcasts that do things like that. There's one that's called Another Tinfoil Hat, a podcast that's called Beyond Creepy, and yet another one that is called Wartime Stories, that basically do kind of a cold case file sort of approach to paranormal accounts, records, and encounters. So they're actually going back and looking at stuff that has been avoided, ignored, forgotten, and pulling it up and seeing what can be seen there with new light, new eyes. And of course, as part of this, the reason why it's important to suspend your own beliefs, theories, and presuppositions is that time and time again, I have seen investigators tripped up by their own beliefs about a matter. As much as I loved Paul Eno, and he was like a great colleague, probably one of the greatest human beings I've ever met, he could not shake his fundamental convictions about evil in the world, and this intruded into his interpretations of hauntings and what he referred to as parasitical activity, and it hindered his ability to accept data from sources that could have actually bolstered not only many of his theories and conclusions, but perhaps helped him with aspects of the experiences that troubled him. Eugenia Macer-Story also had some of these issues. In fact, in one of her more prescient self-observations and reflections, I think it's in her Dark Frontiers book, she wonders to herself if her Roman Catholic upbringing had impeded her ability to correctly interpret some of her own paranormal experiences. And what I really like about Eugenia is that she regarded her life as an experiment. She made herself the experiment in an investigation of how paranormal experiences are created and if they could be altered at will, which is kind of interesting. And one of her best books, I've got to pull this book up. I don't know if you can make me a whole thing here. This book right here, Battles with Dragons, Certain Tales of Political Yoga. I really think it's a play on Jane Roberts' Psychic Politics when I've read it. You can see her technique, but you can also see some of the problems with her technique, in which she details the hidden complexities and complications of regular, everyday, and often annoying interactions that one might have, and it's clear she often did have, in New York City with babysitters that cancel at the last minute, taxi drivers with odd affects and stranger stories, and literary agents who seem to be clueless but drag in a mountain of chaos behind them. What her stories reveal is that the bizarre and what we call paranormal is intricately wound in and through everyday life, in synchronicities, odd patterns of meeting or not, the right or wrong people at precisely the wrong or right time, and that we just tend to ignore it. In other words, people are just as strange as any ghost or alien popping out of a mothership somewhere. Still, the language that she uses to investigate these unfoldings and her own reactions to them is decidedly religious. She redefines what terms like demonic possession and curse and being haunted might mean, and it's dazzling, but you have to know what she's doing. And this is part of why I think some people have found her obscure. She's demonstrating that we're all kind of in these theatrical productions and that they are weird. You know, we're all part of it. But if you don't get that, if you don't get that it's like David Lynch, you won't understand what she's saying. And it's interesting because she had the same birthday that David Lynch had. Well, April 20th. It was different. January 20th. January 20th, different years, but she's similar in to David Lynch in a lot of ways. In other words, you have to kind of reach into her language in order to understand what she's saying. But once you understand what she's saying, it's really profound. So, you know, those are kind of the limitations. She can get past some of her own language and all that. Don't draw conclusions too quickly. It's even better if you keep your conclusions suspended, or at least your mouth about them shut, at least most of the time. Time and time again, and I'm not the only investigator who has said this, partly in jest, we find ourselves going out to the field or the library determined to be the most scientific mind out there, only to find ourselves saging our apartments later on, just in case something followed us home. And that is literally what experience teaches us. But the most important thing, these are the most important points. Finally, don't lose the fun. Maintain your sense of humor and pay attention to synchronicities. Synchronicities are the signs that your research is doing its job, because there is a task that's going on, and you will each find what your task is. I know that sounds bizarre and obscure, but everybody who's been in this business for a little while, they kind of realize that. One of the bylines of the mystical order in which I'm an initiate says that when synchronicities and paranormal events occur, you've been given a glimpse of the levels of greater order and pattern out of which our seemingly solid reality emerges. Because of our focus, we will only ever get a glimpse from time to time. We would have trouble functioning in our arena if we consistently lived with more than glimpses. In a sense, we're not supposed to get more than glimpses. You know, there are people who get more than glimpses and they kind of go nuts. You know, it's hard for them to live here anymore. In that order, we are also counseled to have a sense of humor about it, as the universe seems to exhibit a definite sense of irony, and to let it go. Apparently, Tibetan Buddhists counsel much the same, as do my indigenous teachers. So as Agent Cooper puts it in Twin Peaks, gentlemen, when two separate events occur simultaneously pertaining to the same object of inquiry, we must always pay strict attention. It's kind of like a rough and ready understanding of what a synchronicity is. And if you carefully read through a lot of the literature of Dr. Jacques Vallée, of John Keel, of Paul Eno, and Eugenia Macer-Story, all of them had wicked, ironic senses of humor that came through at various levels in their writing and in their interviews. So read, listen, do your research, contribute your piece to the puzzle, be a nice person, have a good time. I'm done, Smiles.
Well, thank you for that, Professor Wham. Yeah, all such good advice. I know folks so often, you know, enter this field with this exuberance that wants them to lead them to out into the fields and do those investigations. And that's certainly an important and valid part of this. I was joking before with you that, you know, I'm more of an armchair investigator,
Right.
information collator, preserving the information, trying to see the pattern. And I think people can do both, but the balance, keeping oneself balanced. I've often, my mantra to people is cultivate a high tolerance for ambiguity and,
Right.
And try to remain positive, because it is so easy to slip into a predominantly negative worldview with these types of things. This is something that Keel has, of course, driven home many times in his books, that so many people who engage with this phenomena, it's like you were saying, these experiences are transformative, and that can be a really positive thing. it can also lead you down some dark paths.
Exactly.
Um,
Oh, hi, Kitty. I didn't see the kitty there. Hi, Kitty.
yeah, he snuck into your lecture. And your comment about trying to be in the field of be scientific, and then coming home and saging
Your apartment,
well,
yeah.
that leads directly to one of our audience members' question. What are your thoughts on the so-called hitchhiker effect, where one studies the phenomena, it tends to follow them from the investigation sites to their homes?
Right. Well, this happens. I mean, and it happens to the most intensely scientific people. I mean, my favorite example of this, and I've talked about it in one of my blogs, is Harley Rutledge, who was, he was a physics teacher and trained in geology and optics. And he was studying the Piedmont flap in the early 70s in Missouri, southern Missouri. And he went out there and they were gonna set up, an entirely scientific thing. And because he thought it was probably a natural phenomenon, and he just wanted to see if they could figure out, like, the patterns of it. And not only did they did get some initial data, but not only were they driven out of the regular field where they were by storms, but he found that it followed him home. And so he didn't have to go to this far place anymore. And it followed him to his house, where it appeared to members of his family. It never got any closer than that. It seems that part of the reason why it didn't is because he didn't pursue it beyond a certain point. You know what I mean? In his mind, he just he made sure that he kept his as much as possible his personal life and his professional life. He was a professor at a state college, and his investigations, he tried to keep them as separate as possible. But he does talk about this in some of his in a couple of his later presentations to MUFON, and how curious that was. And, if I take, Eugenia and Paul's a really good example of this, or John Keel, the most important part of being positive, and I think this is what happens with people when they're confronting something that they don't understand, that's scary. We're a lot of us have been raised, like on horror films and stuff. And so we have a tendency to think, oh, bugaboo, it's like, this terrible thing's going to happen. What's going to happen? And the way Paul would always put it, and certainly John Keel acted this way. I mean, I don't know that he ever said this, but he certainly was this way in his personal life. We have an absolute right to be here too. And we have an absolute right to be in our space. Now, it could be, if I'm going to be astrological about it, it could be because both Paul and John were Aries. You could attribute it to that if you want to. But it's like, we have a right to be here. This is my space, and you need to leave. And John Keel actually did that a couple of times to things that would try to intrude into his apartment. Eugenia had a little bit more trouble with some of that because of her background. As I mentioned, she had a tendency, she wasn't afraid of certain types of phenomena, but she did become kind of paranoid in her later life because of her own questions about herself. But she was still able to maintain a safe place in her house for herself. So it's really, really important to kind of assert yourself. It's like, yeah, this weird crap is here, but I'm here too.
And that does remind me of Ann Ruffle, the UFO researcher.
Right, exactly.
Who obviously came from I believe a more Christian religious background, who researched abductees, experiencers who seemingly had success invoking Jesus's name as a way of banishing these negative experiences, or whatever types of experiences they were happening. Others have seemingly had success with that. And I that's not to advocate for any particular religion or not, but I do think that there is something to that. And
Well, this is Paul Eno's. He actually gave me a galley copy of this before it was published. So this is the galley copy of his last book, Dancing Past the Graveyard. There are two things about this. There are three things about this book that are important. The first thing about this book is that it's probably his most autobiographical book. So it's almost a summation of his life. So I would recommend it for that. The second thing about this book is that this book has like a foreword or an intro that was written by Nick Redfern. And of course he got Nick Redfern to do this because Redfern has a recognizable name. But what's interesting is that Redfern completely misses the point of the book. Because the first part of the book is where Paul talks about how he developed this theory about parasites, parasitical entities that prey on people. And of course, some of it is kind of scary. And so that's what Redfern talks about. Redfern doesn't talk about the entire second half of the book. The entire second half of the book is how to not let this happen to you. You know, in other words, the things that you can do. And he said, it doesn't have to be Jesus. It can be whatever it is. There are people that are not religious that can do this. You don't have to be religious. It has to do with focusing on what is good in your life, what is positive in your life, having loving relationships, laughter, working. A lot of times poltergeists in particular prey on people who have had difficult things in their lives. And that tends to get people all wound up in those. And I happen to know this because I used to live this way. These kind of downward spirals of depression that you can't get out of. And he has a lot of advice about how you can keep that from happening, as well as accounts of positive entities. In fact, he says at the beginning, not all entities are parasites. Please don't think that, and so he provides. So it's like the book has this difficult part, but it also has this really good part. And I wish Nick would have included the good part. But you can read it and get it, so
great. I'll have to check that out. No, actually, Nick is somebody who popped into my mind as you were describing the importance of having a day job and having
right.
a whole other life. And in as long as I've known Nick, it was quite a long time before I realized that he's known as this prolific writer. He would be turning out regular books on all these amazing different topics, but he had a whole other life, has a whole other life. My kitty is wanting out. He took on a lot of other writing jobs, and
Right,
exactly. These were not in the paranormal field. That was, again, like John Keel or others, right. If you're a good writer, you can write anything, as long as you hopefully find some interest in it. But also just he's an example of somebody who, you could go and have a beer with, and talk about everything else besides the paranormal. And that's, I think, as you were saying, important.
Right. It is important. And then just to briefly answer that person's questions, it would sort of depend on what kind of thing hitchhikes back, so it would be like, depending on, is it just poltergeist stuff that's coming back, or just, like, what is it? Because some things are going to be a little bit easier to deal with than others, but the basic idea is, it just because it comes back with you, I'll as my indigenous teachers would put it, so you're out there looking for it. So it's going to go, oh, you're looking for it. Somebody's interested. I'm, it's going to follow you home because you're looking for it. It's interested. So it doesn't have to be as terrible or scary as you think it is. I've had the experience. Gail has had the experience. I know lots of Pine Bush people have had that stuff follow them home, and usually doesn't, if you don't pay it too much mind and remain positive and thinking, but don't be scared of it, basically, it tends to go away after a little while. It loses interest.
Keep those boundaries.
Yeah, keep those boundaries.
You mentioned your own experience with precognitive dreams or visions. That's something I had in my youth, and I do think it's actually a more common experience than people realize in the population.
I think it's very common, actually.
A good friend and audience member, Stan Shaw, asks, have you come across any current writings on retrocausality or the apparent melding of past, present, and future, like the 1927 book of E.W. Dunn's An Experiment in Time?
Well, it depends on what you consider to be legitimate data for examination. A lot of Eugenia Macer-Story stuff does that because she experimented with that a lot in her own life. That's part of the reason why I like the Seth material, because a big chunk of the Seth material concerns itself very specifically with that, especially the 2 volumes called The Unknown Reality, which are probably the most complex of all of those writings. Because in those writings, the Seth attempts, this personality entity essence, as he referred to himself, attempts to actually explain how non-physical reality becomes manifest. And it's pretty complicated. And he uses these examples in Jane and Rob's own lives, where they have a series of dreams about the house they're going to move to and parallel lives that they're living or have lived. I mean, it's actually very complicated. So it just sort of depends on, what would be considered data that this person would want to use. There's actually quite a bit of stuff about it. I'm looking through the piles of books that I have on my on my desk near to me, because there are a couple of other books that have been very specifically written along those lines that are not New Age books either. But certainly there are a lot of physics books that talk about that, about the possibility of that.
Stan, if Eric Wargo is an author who's really gaining a lot of attention for his writings on that very subject, and that idea is interesting to me, in that it's less about the idea that somehow these precognitive visions are like clairvoyant type of seeings of the actual future events, but are actually more kind of like completing the loop of remote viewing, where when you finally do see the target, that's when you're sending the signal back to yourself that you were precognizing.
Right. Well, it's kind of like deja vu. I mean, it's kind of like deja vu, purposeful deja vu, not just spontaneous deja vu, but the realization that, because I've had deja vus that weren't just deja vus. They were deja vus that were time stamped in my brain, time stamped. And as I was having them, I remembered exactly when I dreamt about them in the past. I dreamt this 6 months ago, but I didn't remember the dream, but then I remember the dream. So I've had that happen so many times. And then it unfolds in exactly the way I dreamt it, and I can't stop it. That's the worst part about deja vu, is it just sort of, but yeah, so basically the idea there is that it's not even that you're seeing the future, it's that you're seeing that the future and the past and the present are all kind of part of one thing, essentially.
Yeah, so much so this phenomena, or the phenomena surrounding UFOs and the paranormal, I think does drive us towards this conclusion that we experience linear time as a convenience, and that it's all available to us at all times, in certain states typically. And what you were just describing reminds me of my own personal experience. One of the youngest weird experiences I had, where I was having what people would describe as a deja vu experience, except it was more detailed, and as everybody sitting around a table was speaking, I knew what everybody was going to say.
Everybody.
to the point where I could sense what I was going to say that was going to cause me a great deal of embarrassment. And so I didn't say it and seemingly changed the outcome. This wasn't a case of where I knew whether I had a dream about it, but those instances, again, with Eric Wargo and others, obviously, keeping a dream journal can be so important in trying to experiment with this and document it.
Right. No, right. And that's what I do. I mean, I keep a dream journal, and I keep along with that, I keep a journal of like strange coincidences that pop up in my eyes.
Synchronicity.
Synchronicity is sort of the key. That's what Eugenia was like obsessed with. She was obsessed with synchronicities.
Yeah.
And she did find that things are connected in really interesting ways, like at all times. And we just don't investigate all those connections most of the time. We're just sort of, our sense of linear time, and that this is what's in the Seth material. Actually, Paul Eno talks about this. This is in the second part of the book I just showed you as well. He outlines this. So he's actually a good source for looking at those theories of retrocausality as well. But basically, it's like what he discovered is that and what he argues is that our experience of linear time is an artifact. It's an artifact of our ego focus. And because of our ego focus and the peculiar kind of ego that humans have in particular, we experience time in a very specifically linear way. And in the Seth material, there's a reason given for that, which is interesting. And that the reason is that for some reason in this reality, this arena that we're in here, that we find ourselves in, this arena has sort of evolved or been picked, or however you want to put it. It's evolved as a place by which and humans have the ability to generate meaning out of this. That's sort of our creative capacity. And but and we're also kind of learning certain rules of causality. So we have to have this kind of focus in order for this to happen. But obviously, the universe is much larger and more complicated than this. So then it's just a matter of what you believe about it. You know what I mean? But actually, yeah, the second section, the part 2 of this Paul Eno book, Dancing Past the Graveyard, he talks about it. He talks about parallel worlds and the paranormal on steroids. What is God? And he talks about that's where he talks parallel worlds and God. What does that mean? What does that imply about our conceptions of God and the divine? Of course, he's a theologian, so he's going to be concerned with that. Personally, I could care less about that, but it's important to him, and it's obviously important to some people.
Yeah. I'm curious what your experience has been with various organizations that try to tackle these topics. The most obvious being like MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. I'm wondering if you engaged with them either recently or back when you were doing your dissertation research, or other organizations. A lot of, there's so many local groups, whether they be Bigfoot research groups, or ghost paranormal investigating groups. Have you had much experience engaging with those types of organizations?
When I was doing my research for my master's, up until the point of my dissertation, I was a member of MUFON for a few years. And part of the reason for that was so that I could connect with the local MUFON people where I was, so that I could, because I needed subjects for my field research. So there was a reason for that. That was also the only time period, I talked about this in a recent blog, that was the only time period where I ever had any kind of weird sense of being surveilled. It was during that time period that I was living in a rural area at the time, and that's the only time when my mail was ever tampered with, and a few other things, little things happened. Other than that, the only other groups I've ever really been involved with have been local groups. Like I'm a consultant, whatever they're called, for Gail and her Bigfoot researchers of the Hudson Valley group. I've also done some consulting work with some of the ghost hunting groups around here in the Hudson Valley, of which you can imagine there's tons of them. And a lot of what I do for Gail, for example, what I do is if she encounters someone reports to her some possible cryptid behavior or cryptid stuff that also contains other weird things, like UFO stuff, or which the UFO stuff scares her to death. She hates it. Or ghost stuff. She doesn't like that very much either. She'll call me in to help her do some field research because I'm not bothered with those questions, and then we kind of then collaborate, on what's going on. But so it's been mostly local groups. I have tended to, since my MUFON experience, I have tended to sort of go my own way in a lot of ways. I'm not much of a joiner. That's part of it. That's part of me. But also because I don't like the politics of groups like that. I tend not to join anything because I don't like. In fact, me being in this mystical order that I'm in has been sort of a project for me because, I like being in it, but at the same time, it's like, I don't like half of the people, it's just the way I am, guys, I'm kind of an introvert and sort of a crab and, but I do think that it's important to be connected to people despite myself. So, I do connect with local groups here, and that's been sort of the level of my involvement.
Well, I want to thank you so much for today. I always love hearing what you've got to say about anything and everything. I can't recommend your website enough, and your blog, and I especially, of course, love your vlog, your video logs, where you present the writing, but it's on your YouTube channel. Folks can find out more about Professor WHAM at professorwham.com. And of course, as I mentioned, she's got this great book. Besides Mysterious Beauty on the Hudson Valley, there's also final season of Lovecraftian Quartet. And so you can find out more about her over there. And
most important, both of these books are on Audible.
I was just noticing I was listening to who the narrator was on
Michael Hacker. Hacker.
So many UFO and paranormal books as a narrator is fantastic.
Yep.
Well, I can't wait to hear what you've got next. If there's anything you want to promote right now, feel free. And would definitely be talking to you again. Absolutely. And folks can go to the website. There's contact information there at professorwham.com. And just can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. This is kind of an honor to be in your initiatory sort of circle of what you're doing here.
Thank you. And yes, folks, for future reference, of course, this is all because of the new patreon.com/anomaly archives, where if you're a patron, a donor at the Anomaly Academy cadet level or higher, where you have access to these live lectures where you can interact with the presenter, ask questions, and get first access. And then, of course, also access to the growing back catalog of presentations. And we've got lots more planned for the future. Coming up next month is a presentation by Joshua Cutchin.
Oh, that'll be great.
Yeah, Saturday, August 24th, he's going to be presenting on Soulcraft, Understanding the UFO as a Death Symbol, which, of course, is a reference to his massive 3-volume set, Ecology of Souls. It's a fantastic, and there's a good old Terrence McKenna there on the cover.
Good old Terrence.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Professor, if you'll stick around, we'll chat just briefly.
Sure.
And thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you the next time.